This is Books for Breakfast, a podcast where we talk about books and writing. I'm Enda Wiley.
And I'm Peter Sirr.
And you're all very welcome to this morning's show.
As I speak, it is 1,002 days since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, but over 10 years since Putin first seized Crimea and sponsored insurrection in the Donbass, and even longer that he sought to meddle in Ukrainian affairs. So we thought we would mark those suffering-filled days and years by talking to Oksana Makysmchuk, whose Still City, Diary of an Invasion, published by Carcanet Press, came out this year. Oksana is also translator and co-editor of Words for War, New Poems from Ukraine. We caught up with Oksana at Books Upstairs in Dublin, where she read from her work and talked to poet Moya Cannon. And indeed we also talked to Moya about her assessment of Oksana's work.
Intimate relationship. I bought a hat of fox mink fur to wear in the war. In my hat I sit in my cellar waiting. The enemy's late. I read his messages on my phone, popping open jars of strawberry jam lining the cellar walls. Like a lover, my enemy sends me flowers, emojis, words of condolence, supplications, doctored screenshots, explicit photos.
That was Oksana Makysmchuk reading Intimate Relationship, which is the first poem in her debut collection in English, Still City, Diary of an Invasion, published this year by Carcanet Press. So we're here in Books Upstairs with Oksana, and you're very welcome to Dublin, and it's your first time here, and welcome to Books Upstairs indeed. So Oksana was born in Lviv in Ukraine, and she's the author of two acclaimed collections of poems in Ukrainian. And she's also co-editor of Words for War, New Poems from Ukraine, which you can read online or you can buy it as a book. And it's an anthology of which it's been said, these poems have the potential to permanently inscribe themselves in the global canon of war poetry. Still City, Diary of an Invasion, is Oksana's first book of poems in English. And as the title suggests, the book takes the form of a diary of the invasion of Ukraine by Putin's Russia, starting in the early days before the invasion has actually taken place. The early parts of the diary are a kind of a tense waiting process as people wait in a state of anxiety or disbelief or just general fear. To a lot of people, it just didn't seem possible that it would happen. And in her foreword, Sasha Dugdale quotes an interview with the poet where she says, what our grandparents experienced in the late 30s and 40s, the destruction of cities and towns, the execution and torture of civilians, the millions of refugees, it was inconceivable that it could happen within our lifetimes.
Yeah, inconceivable indeed. And Oksana, you're very welcome. But could we begin with that sense of disbelief? It's very striking, for instance, in a poem like Arguments for Peace, when you write, how could there be a war in this city with cobblestone streets, glowing stars in the windows, festive dogs and full deer antlers? Or you say, war wouldn't dare come, seeing how happy we are, how good our lives, and all that we've got to lose. We love our children too much. We love our homes too much. And so we argue time and again, there'll be no war. There'll be no war. So I suppose, Oksana, what I'm wondering is, did it really seem to you in those early days that you might yet escape the clutches of war?
Yes, I think many of us couldn't actually reconcile ourselves to something that seemed obvious to so many politicians around the globe, of which we were warned as an imminent threat, an imminent invasion. So it did seem like it was bound to happen. And at the same time, we were really in denial that it was going to happen because of how inconvenient and terrible it would make our lives. So it was one of those moments where the future had already formed. It's like, a child in utero that you can sense the contours of, or if you use special technology, you can see even. But for us, it was still behind this veil of concealment, and we were unwilling to face it.
And that early sense of sort of disbelief starts obviously to change when the war becomes real. And it turns into the horror then of what is happening. I mean, there's a poem, for instance, called Post-Truth. Some say it didn't happen, others that it was staged. corpses from morgues laid out for an exhibition. Again, that kind of sense of unreality. This can't be happening, but at the same time, a recognition that, yes, it is. I mean, that moment must have been very hard to deal with. I'm thinking of a poem like Rocket in the Room, that the way it's like a shocking kind of conjunction of ordinary domesticity. And then you have this instrument of war right there in the room. And actually, I wondered if you might read that poem for us.
Rocket in the Room. What the rocket has in common with the room full of children is its current location. Somebody thought the rocket belonged in the room with children, and now it's here. In time, someone else will come and collect the pieces of the rocket and of the children, weeping and shouting insults at the sky. But for now, this rocket and these children are an unsorted matter, a puzzle awaiting a solution.
So all of a sudden, this horrific reality becomes the norm, and it's what's there. And it must have been very strange for you to record that. Not least, I think, because, one of the things you need to record it is a sort of objectivity, almost like a repertorial sort of detachment. I wonder, was it hard to be detached about recording an invasion, recording a war in a diary as you've done?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I gave it some thought because I started writing war poems first in 2014 when Crimea was first annexed. My husband is from Crimea, so we had family trapped there and who still live there under occupation. And I started writing this cycle of poems in Ukrainian, and it felt much too intimate. There was not so much of reflective distance. It was more of a mythical fairy tale type of lamentation, and I worked around the topic by describing different types of beasts, endowing them with various features attributable to war that would try to conceptualize what this war is. But it was this it was also an attempt at mediation, but it had this very childlike feel, these types of poems. So I feel that switching to English actually enabled me to gain reflective and critical distance sufficient for this sounding like a reportage by somebody who is and who isn't directly involved in the situation, who can assess it as if she were looking from the outside and from this more atemporal, unsituated perspective. And I think that also lends the poems this feeling of estrangement from what is happening. Why these I think juxtapositions strike readers as uncanny, because these things shouldn't be happening in the same space at the same time, and yet they are. And I can record it because I am outside of the situation.
Yeah, that's interesting. And just talking about recording, the book is subtitled Diary of an Invasion, and it's organized exactly in that way as a diary. So you clearly wanted to tie it to a particular time in a particular place. So could you say something about your decision to structure it as a diary? And then I was also wondering about that idea that there must be a tension between the poet and the diarist, or the poet and the witness. Could you just talk a little bit about that?
Certainly. So it has the subtitle of a diary, but the I of the poems is clearly not always the person who is the poet making the recording. So it's a diary in a very literary sense, where there are multiple perspectives that I'm trying to investigate and inhabit that are not always my own. So it's an artifice. The whole idea of a diary as an organizing principle, it's a chronicle of the experiences of the poet, but it doesn't mean that it's a poet's autobiography, or that it has historical accuracy in the way that, you cannot really reconstruct the facts of my life by reading this document. And at the same time, it does aspire to be truthful and to bear witness to this moment and to the civilian experience of awaiting the invasion and then experiencing the invasion.
Because I think that's often a thing that readers confuse. They think this is actually the poet speaking, whereas poets do have imaginations and they can get into another world by imagining what it's like. So, yeah, that's very interesting. Thanks for answering that question.
I mean, the ordinary and the terrible keep colliding kind of throughout the collection. And you've spoken of the blessedness of inertia as a form of resistance. And it's as if ordinary life becomes a kind of resistance. And then I just wondered, what does it mean to you and to the subjects of your poems to lead a normal life, kind of in quotation marks, but amid chaos, amid that kind of chaos?
I think that's exactly right. That for many people, just a commitment to their small pleasures and to their work and to the kinds of things they would do despite the war or outside of the war, that is a form of resisting the terror, because usually to give in to the terror would be to modify your way of life, to try to work around it and to accept it as the new reality. And so I think in many ways it's this commitment to the everyday and the habitual that not only preserves your sanity in these situations, it's a kind of ritual that keeps you afloat, but also that is a marker of resilience. We have to be able to think our way back into the situation when there was no war and to imagine a place when there is no war. Otherwise, war is like an infection that's going to take over all of your thoughts, and it can easily just, make you into its portal. Like you will be the speaker of war and of terror. And yeah, I think that the commitment to the food and the family and the home, all of these daily things that save us and preserve us, that I also try to capture as tracks and traces of normality in the world that had been changed.
Yeah, and I think we all agree with that family and love and kindness and generosity, it has to keep going on. But you're an acclaimed poet in Ukrainian. You're a distinguished translator of poetry from Ukrainian. You've spoken earlier there about why you chose to write in English in this collection. But you've also edited the acclaimed Words for War and New Poems from Ukraine, an anthology of contemporary poetry. How have other Ukrainian poets responded to the war?
In different ways, and this anthology it's available online, and I highly encourage anyone to read it. It's wordsforwar.com, and there we gathered 16 different poets. When we started, it was still 2014, and the anthology came out in 2017, so it may seem that it only captures a sliver of this experience and it would have now been outdated, but in fact a lot of these poems are as relevant now as they were when we first translated them, collected them into the anthology. And the experiences are varied. We did try to not limit the war poems to poems written by soldiers or medics or people in the trenches who have direct access to the war. So we did, from the very beginning, try to expand the category and to make it about experiences of war that are also had by civilians and women and people who have relatives in the war zone but who are not perhaps directly involved with the war effort. And so it's this very mediated, I think, often grasp of what is happening somewhere in the distance, kind of spilling into your life from the news, from the screens, from reports of friends and family who are trapped in these terrible situations, but often not experienced directly. So that's a very interesting aspect of this poetry. That so much of this, I think, it brings out that usually when you do experience war, it's not as a direct witness to conventional sense of warfare, like you're a Homeric hero standing in the middle of the field and you're surrounded by those people on the one side and other people on the other side, and there are gods standing behind you and in your midst. It's this very different, more, I think, subtle and complex experience of what it means to be a part of the war effort. It's the people also in the besieged city. It's the family members of the warriors in the distant lands who are awaiting their return. So it brings all of this community, I think, into view as well.
Yeah, that's amazing. There's a long tradition of older poets offering advice to younger ones. I'm thinking of Rilke's letter to a young poet, for instance. But you have a poem called Advice to a Young Poem, not Advice to a Young Poet. And I was wondering, would you read that for us, Oksana? I'm really curious to hear that advice. It would be nice to hear it, wouldn't it, Peter?
Advice to a young poem. Stay little, poem, fine and sharp like a charm, mysterious, a maker of no sense. Fewer things can go wrong with fewer lines. Fewer promises break in fewer words. Little ones trickle out of the cage through bars one can barely see, seep through the capillaries in a windowless and evasive mind that's devised ways to protect itself against spells and magic. Helpless yet busily resilient, they form like clouds, woven of gauze and mucus, dealing in recovery of broken hope, delivery of the forgotten, inessential yet dear. Little ones of no weight are enough to transform as one peers into the sky to the sound of an air raid siren, falls asleep in a bathtub, dances inside a cellar.
You've travelled very widely, and I was wondering how your periods of sort of temporary displacement, if you like, in Budapest and the US and Vienna, Warsaw, shaped the emotional kind of undercurrents of Still City? I mean, did, for instance, your experiences in Chicago add new dimensions or shifts in perspective as you finalized the collection?
Yes, certainly. So Warsaw was interesting to me in many ways because it's a city that had been completely destroyed during World War II. It was razed, and I think there was so little hope that anything would be rebuilt, that people would live there again, that life would be normal, and yet 80 years later, it is. So in many ways, it's a kind of reminder that wars do come to an end, and at the end, you have to restore what has been lost to make the city habitable again for the people who will continue doing all of these human things that we do, like cooking meals and gathering family and falling in love and reading books. So that was a very, we lived right in the middle of the ghetto that had been destroyed, but the building where we lived had survived, actually. And it was an entrance, I think, to the ghetto. And just being in this historical space and thinking back on all of the people who have been within those walls and who had perished in those streets, and whose memory is honored, but whose names are often forgotten because the historical processes have displaced them. That too has been very important, I think, for the perspective I take in the collection, which is more removed and trying to envision things once as if it were maybe not something that would go on interminably, but that would come to an end and would acquire a different expression. Because I think there will be wars as long as there is humanity. This is just seems to be the way we resolve our conflicts. So it's also about the past wars and trying to envision the future of war with these descriptions of the new technology we have devised to make us more efficient at eliminating the enemy, which is just as human as we are. And in the States, I was struck, I think, by the perceived sense of danger of living in the States. People in Hyde Park would be like, oh, you must be so relieved to be in a safe place after living in Ukraine. And I had just come back from Ukraine, where I would walk through the city for 40 minutes to the screams of an air raid siren, in the dark, and would feel completely safe. And in Chicago, in Hyde Park, I couldn't walk 10 minutes in the street and feel like my life was not in danger. So I think it also helped thematize for me how there are different practices and different norms, and just the extent to which, for example, in America, we are habituated to the risks of, different rights that we hold so dear, to carry guns, for instance. And the way it makes it feel like a war zone, and at the same time, we are kind of unaware that this is actually what we are living with and what we are dealing with.
Well, speaking of the States, we did want to ask you, things are so difficult at the moment globally. Are you concerned about the implications of Donald Trump's presidency for Ukraine? Are you concerned?
I think everyone is, but we don't know what's going to happen. I mean, one of the biggest fears surrounding Trump presidency is that we will end up dragged into some kind of military confrontation that none of us really endorse, but that our leadership, which has nothing to lose from losing a war or losing people in a war, is going to get us into. And there are multiple indications that things could go in a very violent direction, whether Ukraine is involved or not.
Thank you very much to Oksana. If we could turn to Moya Cannon now, who's also a poet published by Carcanet, and we'll be introducing Oksana's work tonight at Books Upstairs. So Moya, you're very welcome as well. And we're just wondering what drew you to Oksana's poetry.
Well, when I opened Still City first, I was absolutely knocked out by it. It's an extraordinary book, really extraordinary. It's a wonderful book about terrible times. There's a wonderful quote by Ilya Kaminsky where he speaks about the terrifying restraint in these poems. And that is actually what struck me first. She says so much in so few words, and and it's the restraint which gives the poem their power, I think. And what's not said. What she frames, but does not say. And I think the poems they're short. They're very, as she says in her address to a young poem, they're small and sharp. She uses very odd sort of punctuation. She uses capital letters but no full stops, and I think this actually puts great pressure on the syntax, because the sentences have to be short and clear, and the images juxtaposed. There's a wonderful and terrifying surreality about these poems, and it was only when reading them, poems like Rocket in a Room, for instance, or drone footage, where I began to realize for the first time really why surrealism emerged after the First World War, where what should be, well, you say, the abnormal in very normal surroundings, particularly, as I say, in when war comes to a civilian context. There are also moments of extraordinary amongst she speaks of distance. You spoke earlier of distance. And I'm reminded of something that I think was Juan Mayro said. He overstated it. He said, a poem should be conceived with a soul of fire, or a work of art, should be conceived with a soul of fire, but executed with a clinical coldness. These are not clinically cold, but there's a soul of fire, and yet there's this great distance which gives them power. And then there are moments, amidst all of the incredible tension, and you developed very well, or reflected very well how the tension mounts as it goes on in a diary. Little moments of light in it, where she's trying to bake pastries in an outdoor kitchen. As I said somewhere else, trying to just preserve moments of beauty in the midst of all of this, and also moments of tenderness in the midst of all the awfulness. Where somebody's blown up on a street, and somebody walking a dog is blown up in the street, a little pug dog, and a neighbour comes out, or somebody in a house nearby comes out and covers the body with a sheet with little flowers on it, and puts out a little pillowcase for the little pug dog. And it reminded me of something that a friend of mine, who's very interested in graveyards, etc., said, that flower pollen is found in the very, very earliest burials, and this impulse to sort of honour a stranger and it's a magnificent book, really magnificent.
Yeah, thank you, Moya. I mean, Peter and I as well, we were really moved by the poems. And I agree with you, there's a kind of pared back quality to them. And that's what intensifies the emotion and your use of punctuation as well, Oksana. I too found that startling. But the collection is a startling and magnificent one. So thank you so much to Oksana Makysmchuk for coming in today and sitting at the breakfast table with us and talking about her debut collection of poetry in English, Still Life, Diary of an Invasion from Carcana Press, and also to the poet Moya Cannon. Many thanks. And as always, huge thanks has to go to Books Upstairs, Ireland's greatest bookshop, for welcoming us all here this evening. So thank you to the two of you. Thank you.
And Oksana Makysmchuk's book, Still City, Diary of an Invasion, is published by Carcanet and is available in all good bookshops, not least Books Upstairs here in De Lier Street. And thanks again to Louisa Earls for facilitating us here this evening. The anthology co-edited by Oksana Makysmchuk, Words for War, is available at wordsforwar.com and is also available in book form.
I think we've reached the end of our Books for Breakfast podcast this morning. I'm definitely rushing off to have more coffee. And I'm Enda Wiley and I have Peter Sirr here with me. And Peter, would you like to tell everyone about the details of the podcast if they'd like to listen again?
Well, you can subscribe at all the usual sources, Google and Apple and so on. And if you want to check out the notes that go along with this podcast, you can go to booksforbreakfast.buzzsprout.com. And yeah, so
we'll be back again. We'll have the toast on, we'll have the kettle boiling, we will have more books to discuss, and we're looking forward to having you here. So goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.